Since the Basic Fraud website appeared on the internet, we've had many individuals and groups visit that site and download material. And to those individuals and groups, I'd like to say thank you. Many people, whether they live in Australia, New Zealand or Canada, don't understand some of the consequences and implications of the material that is presented on the Basic Fraud website. Hence the reason for this short YouTube video. If you use an Australian, New Zealand or Canadian passport and you run into trouble overseas, how much value do you think that document will be to you? How can you prove your citizenship when the Australian government, New Zealand government and Canadian government relies upon a constitution which in fact states that the head of state is a foreign sovereign? How can you prove your nationality? What value will an Australian, New Zealand or Canadian passport be to you in that situation? While I'm talking about passports, I should mention naturalisation. Naturalisation is where a person with one citizenship gives up that citizenship to take on a new citizenship, usually in the country that they are living in. Many people living in Australia, New Zealand and Canada believe that they have Australian, New Zealand or Canadian citizenship. But do they really? How can they prove that they are a citizen of a nation when their country relies for its law upon appointments made by a foreign king or queen, in this case from the United Kingdom? How can a person prove that they have nationality if the documents that they're relying on to prove that nationality rely on the signature of a viceregal appointment, someone appointed by a foreign queen, herself appointed by the British Parliament at Westminster? How much value do you think that your Australian, Canadian or New Zealand passport will be to you if you run into trouble overseas? For example, many governments will say, and including the Chinese government, that the Citizenship Act you're relying upon to give you your new citizenship was passed by a parliament established under a British constitution and allegedly given royal assent by a Governor-General appointed by a British sovereign, who herself was appointed by the Westminster Parliament. The signatures of the Queen on your royal appointment documents are all at the top of the page, and we know these have been forged by Jack Straw. Anyway, to be a citizen you must prove that you belong to a nation state, and the Australian Constitution states that your country is a self-governing colony. So, how much use do you think your new Australian, Canadian or New Zealand citizenship will be to you? Think about it, because precisely that occurred to a gentleman born in China who thought that he had become an Australian citizenship under the National Citizenship Act of 1948. Double taxation agreements. A double taxation agreement is something which allows a person to live and work in one country and pay tax in that country and not have to pay tax in the country that has given them their citizenship. For example, if you're an American and you come and live and work in Australia, you can retain your American citizenship, but you only pay tax on what you earn in Australia. The American government doesn't take a second bite if there's a double taxation agreement in place. How much value do you think these double taxation agreements are going to be to you if the country that you've come from and where you haven't been paying tax decides that you've earned income and should pay tax? Now, you've been paying tax to the Australian, New Zealand or Canadian government all these years. Do you think they're going to give it back? What international forum can they go to prove that you don't have to pay double tax? Because to go to an international forum, they would have to prove themselves that they were a sovereign nation state. And given that their constitution state that they're colonies, and the Australian Constitution states that Australia is a self-governing colony, what international forum would listen to them? What international forum can you rely upon? The fact that double taxation agreements haven't come under the microscope yet doesn't mean that they won't. What about your property rights? What about your commercial and intellectual property rights? What about copyrights and the patents that you've acquired in either Australia, New Zealand or Canada? In order to enforce your rights against the world, again, you'll have to prove that either Australia, New Zealand or Canada are independent sovereign states with the authority to pass valid legislation or enter into internationally binding agreements. Again, if you have any ideas on how you can possibly prove this, please don't hesitate to contact us, because we would love to look at that information. You can't say that there's been a declaration of independence for Australia, New Zealand or Canada. You can't say that any of those countries have a constitution all of their own. They all look to the British Parliament at Westminster for their validity. So your property rights, including your copyrights, are in some peril. How do you enforce a legal judgment? For example, you have a legal case in Australia, New Zealand or Canada against a person or an entity overseas, and you win a judgment against them in either an Australian, New Zealand or Canadian court. How can you get that judgment enforced overseas when the person or entity you are trying to enforce it against will use the same material that is presented on the Basic Fraud webpage? That is, that you don't live in a country with a valid government, with a government that has the authority to pass valid law, and therefore your copyrights and all international agreements entered into are invalid. You're on your own. Good luck. If you don't live in Australia, New Zealand or Canada, and most people in the world don't, what consequences can flow to you from the problems, both constitutional and legal, that are occurring in Australia, Canada and New Zealand at the moment? Many people, particularly Americans, have investments in Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and they have those investments because these places are seen as politically and economically stable. These places are seen as having an entrenched rule of law. Many people, particularly Americans, have managed retirement funds, and many of these funds have placed significant investments in Australia, New Zealand and Canada. Question: when the issues raised on the Basic Fraud website start to raise their ugly heads, how safe do you think your investments will be? How can you invest in Australia, New Zealand or Canadian companies, corporations and trusts, etc., if the governments in place in those countries can't prove that they have any authority to legislate these business structures into existence? For example, how safe is the money you've invested in an Australian or Canadian company if the legislation governing companies comes from a parliament reliant upon another country's parliament and a constitution more honoured in its breach than by its application? And in that regard, please visit the Basic Fraud website and have a look at the documents section under Australian Government, and you'll see that Kevin Rudd, Australia's alleged Prime Minister, never took the prescribed oath as contained in the schedule to what is loosely referred to as Australia's Constitution. Take your time and think through the consequences of that. In order to become Prime Minister, he has to take the oath that appears in the schedule to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, and he did not. Australia, New Zealand and Canada can't pass legislation because their Governors-General haven't been properly appointed by the British Queen. None of them. Check out the documents section under Compare the Queen's signature. All of those signatures, down to the last one, were forged by Jack Straw. And I doubt Mr. Straw did that purely out of the goodness of what passes for his heart. If you visit the Basic Fraud website, you'll notice that all of the royal appointment documents that pertain to the Commonwealth of Australia have in fact been signed at the top of the page. Next time you enter into a contract, sign your contract at the top of the page. And please, let us know how you get on. I'm sure the same thing has happened in New Zealand and Canada, and these are matters for you to check. These are just a few of the issues that deserve your attention. If you know anyone who travels to Australia, New Zealand or Canada, or anyone with business dealings or investments in these countries, please tell them to examine the matters on the Basic Fraud website. It may be the best advice that they've received in a long, long time. And if you know any journalists, ask them to examine the matters on the Basic Fraud website and tell them that we'd only be too happy to talk. Finally, I wish you good luck and I thank you. Bye.